Savo River, late at night. The heat from the day still clung to the ground, rising in faint waves that blurred the edges of the camp's glow. The air was thick, unmoving, carrying only the faint hum of night insects and the occasional rustle from the thorn bushes at the perimeter. The ranger's fire had burned down to a steady bed of embers, the orange glow spilling across the dust in short, uneven arcs. Around it, the camp sat in the sort of quiet that settles after long hours of waiting, when the night has taken on its slow rhythm and nothing is expected to change. Daniel sat on a low stool, elbows on his knees, listening to the dry pop of wood in the fire. Beside him, Joseph kept the same posture, their bodies relaxed out of habit but eyes scanning the darkness beyond the ring of light. Out here, alertness was second nature. Both men knew the difference between the silence of an empty night and the silence before movement. Tonight, it was the latter. It began with the faintest shift in the dark. Not sound, not light, but the way the blackness beyond the thorn trees seemed to thicken in one place. Then it moved, slow, deliberate, and unmistakably alive. A broad outline took shape, shoulders rolling forward one after the other, followed by the low sway of a tail. A lion. Daniel's first instinct was to assess distance, then pace. The distance was closing, though not quickly, and the pace was wrong. A healthy lion moves with a fluid certainty even in a cautious approach, every step balanced by strength held in reserve. This one moved as if strength was being spent in every motion. The left foreleg touched the ground with unusual care, pausing before the next step. That hesitation alone was enough to put both men on silent alert. The lion's head hung low, mane falling forward over part of his face. His ears were forward but still not flicking to track sound. He did not move like an animal hunting or patrolling his range. Daniel knew enough to tell this was not an act of aggression, nor one of confidence. It was something else. Something slower, heavier. As the animal stepped past a charred stump, the firelight caught the pale underside of his mane and a faint ripple of shadow along his flank. Even from where they sat, the men could see the uneven rise and fall of his rib cage, the long draw of each breath. His tail swayed once, twice, and then hung still. There was no sound but the faint scuff of his paws on the packed dirt and the fire's muted crackle. The scent of dust, carried between them, mixed faintly with something sharper, the metallic tang of blood that Daniel recognized instantly. He glanced briefly at Joseph, their eyes meeting in shared understanding. The injury was not visible in detail yet, but its presence was clear. No lion would approach this close to a human camp at night unless driven by thirst, hunger, or desperation. Alone, without the cover of thick brush or the protection of a pride, he was exposed. In these territories, hyenas roamed freely, and a weakened lion was more than a curiosity to them. He's an opportunity. The animal slowed as he neared the camp's outer edge. His paws left shallow depressions in the dust, the prints uneven in depth. Daniel noted the dust clinging to the fur on his lower legs and the ragged edges of his coat where fur had been rubbed or torn. The firelight revealed small flecks of debris tangled in his mane, dried grass, thorn fragments, signs that he had been lying low, possibly hiding or resting in cover for long stretches. When he stopped, the silence seemed to deepen. His head lowered further, eyes fixed on the ground just ahead. His breathing was steady but labored, each exhale longer than the last. For a moment, his gaze lifted toward the fire, catching the light in a dull reflection. There was no flare of challenge, no narrowing in threat, only the muted, watchful stillness of an animal calculating its next movement. Daniel's years on patrol had taught him the importance of letting an animal choose its distance. Step forward too soon, and the fragile moment would shatter. Stay too far, and the chance to intervene might pass. This was the narrow space between those outcomes. Joseph's voice, when it came, was barely audible. "He's hurting." The lion's ears twitched slightly at the sound, though his body stayed in place. He shifted weight from his left foreleg to his right, then back again, testing the balance as though searching for a position that eased the strain. The hesitation in movement was not from fear. It was from pain. The men did not move. They watched the shallow rhythm of his breathing, the slight shiver that passed through his flank when he shifted weight again. The scent of meat from their evening meal still lingered faintly in the air, though not enough to mask the smell of dust and blood. Daniel knew the stakes in plain terms. If the lion turned away now, the darkness would swallow him, and with his current weakness, he might not see another dawn. Predators, scavengers, and even the terrain itself could finish what the injury had begun. If he stayed, there was at least a chance, slim but real, that they could do something. The animal took 2 short steps forward, each slower than the last, until the firelight reached the line of his shoulders. His shadow stretched long behind him, broken only by the movement of his tail. He paused again, head lifting slightly to take in the scents around him. His nostrils flared once, twice, and then the head lowered again. The fire crackled softly, a single ember popping and sending a faint glow upward. The lion's gaze shifted briefly to follow the motion before returning to the ground. His stance was not one of aggression or fear. It was the posture of an animal at the threshold between retreat and approach. In the stillness, every small movement felt weighted. The slight tilt of his ears toward the men, the long pause before each step, the careful way his paws settled into the dirt. It was as though the night itself was holding its breath. Daniel kept his eyes on the lion's front leg, noting the way the muscles bunched before releasing in short, unsteady steps. Whatever injury he carried, it was deep enough to change his entire gait. That kind of wound did not heal quickly. Without intervention, infection alone could be enough to take him down. The men waited, bodies still, breath quiet. It was not fear that kept them motionless. It was the understanding that, in moments like this, the animal's choice mattered more than theirs. The wrong move could send him back into the dark where the risks multiplied with every passing hour. The firelight touched the edge of his face now, showing the lines of his muzzle, the slight dryness at the edges of his lips, and the faint sheen of moisture on his whiskers. His eyes remained steady, unblinking for long stretches, breaking only to blink slowly, as if conserving energy even in that small action. Minutes passed this way, the men watching, the lion deciding. Around them, the night held steady, the insects continuing their song, the thorn bushes unmoving in the still air. Daniel knew they were balanced on the narrow line of chance. If the lion chose to stay, it would open the possibility of help. If he chose to leave, the darkness beyond would likely be the last place he was seen alive. The stakes were as simple and as final as that. And so, under the heat of a Tsavo night, with the fire casting its quiet light, they waited. The lion stood in the half-shadow, breathing slow and deep, the dust rising faintly around his paws. Between them was only the space of choice, and in that space the fragile thread of a life that might yet be saved. The lion moved closer, his silhouette no longer just a shadow against the edge of camp, but a living body illuminated by the warm, shifting glow of the fire. The flickering light revealed more than the heavy set of his shoulders or the tired sway of his tail. It showed the injury that had slowed him, the mark that explained his uneven gait. Along the right flank, just behind the curve of the rib cage, ran a gash, deep and raw. The fur surrounding it was clumped and dark where blood had matted it, the edges sticky with fresh wetness. Even at this distance, Daniel could see how the torn skin glistened when the firelight struck it. The shine dulled only where dust had clung. The shape and placement of the wound told their own story. This was not the clean slice of a thorn or the scrape of a rock. It was jagged, torn in places, the unmistakable result of claws or teeth driven in with force. To Daniel's trained eye, it was the mark of a fight, most likely with another male. Such battles were rarely brief. They were desperate contests for dominance, for territory, for access to a pride. And in this one, the lion had clearly been forced to yield. The victor would have driven him off, and in his condition, retreat would have been the only option. He stepped forward again, slow and deliberate, each movement placed with care to avoid the pull of pain. The left hind leg bore more of his weight now, compensating for the right side. His head hung slightly lower than before, and there was a faint tremor in the muscle near the wound that spoke of exhaustion. It was not just the injury that weakened him. It was the accumulation of hours, perhaps a full day, spent moving on limited strength. Daniel watched without shifting his stance, measuring every change in posture. The lion's tail gave a slow, tired flick, then stilled. For a brief moment he turned his head slightly, offering a clearer view of his flank, and Daniel caught the way the skin around the gash pulled with each breath. It was not deep enough to spill his life in minutes, but it was deep enough to slow him, to keep him from hunting effectively. In this state, time itself was the enemy. Without food, his strength would fade. Without the ability to defend himself, the predators of the night would close in. A faint scent drifted across the space between them, a mix of dust, dry grass, and the metallic edge of fresh blood. It confirmed what Daniel already knew. The wound was recent. The blood had not yet dried completely, and the tissue around the cut still carried the flush of new injury. That meant the fight had happened within the last several hours, perhaps during the cooler part of the afternoon when rival males were more likely to test each other. Whatever the circumstances, he had been moving since then, either to find safety or simply to put distance between himself and the lion that had bested him. Beside Daniel, Joseph kept his gaze on the animal. He leaned just enough to whisper, "That's bad." The words were quiet but clear, carrying no surprise, only the factual recognition of what they were both seeing. The lion did not react to the sound in any overt way, but his ears shifted slightly, catching the low tone. His eyes lifted for a brief moment toward the men, then dropped back to the ground ahead. His stance was cautious, the weight uneven on his legs, his paws settling gently into the dirt as if avoiding any sudden jolt. The slow rhythm of his breathing made the wound rise and fall, each movement a reminder that even stillness carried strain. Daniel's mind moved through the facts in plain terms. The wound was deep enough to sap his strength, but not yet immediately fatal. It would likely become infected without treatment. His ability to hunt or defend himself was compromised. Out here, that combination meant one thing. If left on his own, the odds of survival were low. Predators and scavengers did not hesitate when weakness was sensed. Hyenas especially could smell blood from great distances, and a solitary, injured lion was a target they would test without hesitation. Reaching slowly into a side pouch, Daniel pulled out a small torch fitted with a red filter. The filtered light was dimmer and less startling to nocturnal eyes, and he kept it angled low, letting only the edge of the beam touch the lion's flank. The deeper ridges of the gash became more visible. The edges were raw and slightly swollen, and the center still carried the sheen of moisture. Dried flecks of blood were scattered through the surrounding fur, but the fresh glint told Daniel the bleeding was not entirely finished. He lowered the torch after only a moment. The animal's comfort mattered more than satisfying curiosity, and holding the light too long risked agitating him. The image of the wound was fixed in Daniel's mind, long enough to be the swipe of a claw, torn enough to suggest the force of teeth. Both were common in fights between males, where a single encounter could end with one driven off for good. The lion took another step forward, the movement slower now. His shoulders bunched and released unevenly, the left taking more work than the right, his hindquarters following with care. When he paused again, the space between them felt charged with stillness. The fire crackled quietly, and somewhere beyond the camp's reach, an insect called in the darkness. Everything else seemed to wait. "Easy, boy," Daniel murmured, his voice steady and low. The sound reached the lion's ears. They shifted slightly toward him, but his body remained still. The words were not meant as coaxing so much as a signal of calm, an attempt to keep the night unbroken by sudden noise. In the shifting light, the injury stood out starkly against the curve of the lion's body. The line of the wound was angry and raw, and with every rise of his chest, the edges flexed faintly. It was a wound that demanded energy he no longer seemed to have in reserve. His eyes, when they opened fully for a moment, carried the dull heaviness of fatigue, not the sharp focus of a lion on patrol or in the hunt. Daniel's thoughts returned again to the immediate reality. If the lion collapsed here, in open ground, the danger would come quickly. Hyenas could arrive within hours, drawn by the smell alone, and the lion's current state would leave him unable to fend off more than a few before being overwhelmed. If he turned and walked away now, deeper into the bush, the injury would slow him enough to make finding food or water nearly impossible before the wound worsened. The choice, then, was whether to act, and how. Approach too quickly, and the fragile thread of trust holding the lion here might snap, sending him into the dark to die unseen. Wait too long, and the night could bring threats that neither the lion nor the men could control. It was a narrow, shifting balance, measured in the slow breaths of the animal before them. He stood there a moment longer, tail hanging loose, shoulders angled slightly as if shielding the injured side. The faint wind stirred a few strands of his mane, but he did not move. His paws were planted firmly. The toes splayed slightly in the dust, the weight balanced just enough to keep him upright. The men remained still, the fire's light the only movement between them. The wound was more than a mark of a lost fight. It was a measure of time. Each minute that passed without food, without water, without safety, was another minute the odds slipped further from his favor. And here, in the quiet space between action and inaction, the decision of what to do next hung heavy in the warm air, as certain and as fragile as the life standing in front of them. The lion slowed as he reached the edge of the camp's reach, the firelight brushing over him in uneven strokes, bright one moment and shadowed the next. His pace faltered, one paw lingering in the air before settling back into the dust. He stood there, head slightly lowered, eyes narrowing against the sudden change from darkness to glow. The muscles along his sides expanded and fell with each heavy breath, the movement uneven, pulling faintly at the wound that marked his flank. The smell of cooked meat hung faintly in the still night air, drifting from the camp's earlier meal. His nostrils flared once, then again, the scent pulling him closer in thought if not yet in movement. Hunger was written in the way his tongue shifted briefly against his teeth, but the rest of his body remained still, as if bound by an unseen weight. Daniel watched without shifting his position, his eyes tracking the subtle tremors that passed along the lion's shoulder as he adjusted his balance. Joseph, seated just to the left, leaned forward slightly, careful to keep his movements slow. They knew this was the moment that would decide whether the animal chose to approach or turn back. One step toward the fire would bring him into the safety of the camp's edge, where they could offer help. One step away would send him into the open bush where every sound and scent could signal danger. With his injury, either decision carried risk, but one carried the possibility of survival. The lion blinked, his eyelids lowering slowly before lifting again, the light making his pupils constrict into thin slits. His ears rotated briefly toward the fire's crackle, then back toward the darkness behind him. That backward glance seemed instinctive, a check for what might be following. Even here, so close to human scent and fire, safety was not certain. Daniel could picture the routes he might take if startled, the narrow animal tracks leading into thorn thickets, the shallow dips where scent could be hidden for a time. But in his condition, a retreat into that darkness would be slow, and the scent of his blood would travel far. For a moment, the lion lifted his head, the mane shifting slightly in the night breeze. His chest rose and fell again, deeper this time as though gathering himself. Then, instead of stepping forward, he paused entirely, muscles tensing just enough to hold his weight in place. The hesitation was plain. caught between the primal caution that kept him alive and the pressing need that had brought him here at all. Hunger and thirst pushed him toward the camp, but injury and instinct held him where he was. Neither ranger spoke. Their stillness was deliberate, their bodies open to the firelight but unmoving. They knew that trust, if it was to come, would not be forced. Even the smallest sudden action could send him back into the dark. The night itself seemed to share the pause. The insect calls holding steady, the grass beyond the camp swaying only in the faintest breath of wind. His breathing deepened, each inhale longer, each exhale edged with quiet strain. The smell of food drifted again, carried in a thin wave that made his nostrils twitch. He shifted his forelegs slightly, testing the ground, but stopped before committing to the next step. This was the narrow space between choice and consequence, and the men knew well what hung in the balance. If he moved away now, his chances of surviving the night would drop with every yard of distance. If he stepped forward, there was at least the possibility of rest, water, and enough safety to recover some strength. The lion's gaze moved once more toward the fire, blinking slowly, then returned to the ground at his feet. His tail lifted slightly, then fell, the movement as measured as everything else about him. The fire popped softly. A single ember spiraling upward before vanishing into the dark. Still, he did not move. Daniel felt the weight of the moment stretch, each breath marking another second in which the decision could turn either way. In the quiet, it was clear. The hesitation was not just a pause, it was survival itself, balanced on the thin line between fear and need. Daniel shifted his weight and was enough to confirm what both men were thinking. The lion's hesitation had held him at the edge of the camp long enough to act without forcing the moment. Moving with deliberate care, Daniel rose from his seat and walked toward the supply crate near the fire. His movements were unhurried, each step measured so as not to break the fragile stillness. He reached inside, lifting out a shallow metal basin, the surface cool against his hands. The container was small but enough to serve a purpose. He filled it with clear water from a jerry can, the soft trickle breaking the night's steady hum for only a few seconds. Joseph stepped forward to meet him, taking the other side of the basin so they could carry it together. Their path curved toward the camp's edge, stopping a few paces inside the outer line of light. The lion's gaze followed them, his head turning slightly, but his body did not shift. His ears tilted forward, alert but not alarmed, the lines of tension in his shoulders unchanged. Daniel and Joseph crouched together, setting the basin down on the dusty ground. The water caught the glow from the fire, holding a faint reflection of the flames. They stepped back in unison, creating space between themselves and the offering. The lion's eyes lingered on them a moment longer before dropping to the ground ahead. For a few seconds, nothing happened. The animal stood in place, breathing slowly, his chest rising and falling with the effort it took simply to remain upright. Then, with a slow bend of the neck, he moved his head toward the basin. His front paws shifted forward one after the other, the pads pressing lightly into the dust as he closed the short distance. The smell of water reached him first, and his nostrils widened slightly. His muzzle lowered, whiskers brushing the basin's rim, and he began to drink. The sound of his tongue pulling water into his mouth was steady and unhurried, each stroke long and deliberate. The muscles in his throat worked with each swallow, the movement visible even in the low light. Droplets clung to the fur around his mouth, catching the faint shimmer of the firelight before falling back into the basin. Daniel counted the rhythm in his head: sip, swallow, pause, the pattern of an animal replenishing itself after hours, perhaps days, without enough to sustain it. Joseph kept his voice to a whisper, barely more than breath. Let him take his time. Daniel gave a small nod, his eyes fixed on the lion's posture. The way he stood, angled slightly to protect his injured flank, told Daniel that the wound still pulled with every movement, even here. Yet the act of drinking seemed to ease something in him. His tail gave a faint twitch, then stilled again. For nearly a minute, the only sound was the quiet lap of water and the faint crackle of the fire behind them. The men stayed exactly where they were, their stillness a signal that no further demand would be placed on the animal tonight. Daniel knew the water alone would not save him, not if the wound still raw and the danger of infection growing with each passing hour, but was a start. The simple act of drinking here, in this space between fear and safety, meant the lion had accepted enough of their presence to lower his guard. In the wild, that choice could be as rare and fragile as life itself. When he finally lifted his head, a thin line of water slid from his chin to the ground. He stood a moment, eyes half closed, before turning his gaze toward the darkness beyond the camp. The basin sat between them, still holding water, the faint ripples settling in the night air. What lay ahead for him was uncertain, but for now his thirst had been eased, and the firelight still held him within its reach. The lion stood for a short while after drinking, his head lifting and lowering slightly as if measuring his strength against the weight of the night ahead. His breathing was slow but deep, the kind that draws from every reserve left in the body. Then, without warning, the steadiness in his stance gave way. His front legs folded first, the movement sharp but unhurried, followed by the lowering of his hindquarters until his body met the ground. He settled heavily into the dust, his injured flank pressing against the earth, eyes half closed. It was not the ease of an animal choosing to rest. It was the surrender of one who could no longer carry his own weight. Daniel took in the way his ribs expanded against the dirt and how each exhale left his body almost motionless before the next breath came. Joseph shifted slightly, his voice a low murmur. "He's down." The words carried no relief, only the plain truth of what they both understood. Here, in the open space at the camp's edge, he was exposed. The scent of blood was already in the air, faint but present, and would spread further as the night cooled. Hyenas patrolled these lands in loose, restless groups, their senses tuned to find the weak or dying. Once the smell reached them, they would follow it without hesitation. An injured lion on the ground, alone, could not drive them off for long. The fire crackled behind them, a small sound against the broader stillness of the night. The lion's ears twitched once, but he did not lift his head. His tail lay still along the ground, the tip curling slightly with each slow breath. The wound along his flank glistened faintly, the dried edges meeting darker patches where fresh moisture had gathered. Daniel's eyes traced the shallow rise of his chest, noting the longer pause between breaths now. Fatigue had set in fully, the kind that did not allow for recovery without intervention. Daniel knew that leaving him here was not an option. If the hyenas came, they would arrive in numbers. Even if the lion managed to rise, his injury would slow him to the point where escape was unlikely. The alternative, moving him, carried its own risks. A sudden approach could drive him into the bush, and chasing him would only worsen the wound. But the ground here offered no cover, no protection from the scent trail already building in the air. Waiting meant losing what little time they had. He studied the position of the lion's body. The head turned slightly toward the open plain, the forelegs bent beneath him, and the back legs stretched loosely to one side. It was a posture of exhaustion more than rest. The eyes opened once, slowly, then closed again, the heavy lids lowering until only the faintest glint showed through the lashes. Joseph glanced toward the vehicles parked in shadow, then back to Daniel, the silent question clear in his expression. Daniel nodded faintly. "We can't leave him here." The words were quiet but firm, carrying the weight of decision. The choice was not about comfort. It was about survival through the next few hours. They would need to move him, carefully and without panic, to a place where the light, the human scent, and some shelter could give him a barrier against the night. Every step in doing so would be a risk, but the greater danger lay in doing nothing. In the dim glow, the lion's breathing continued its slow rhythm, the sound just loud enough to mark his presence in the stillness. The camp felt smaller now, the reach of the firelight holding not just warmth but the boundary between life and what waited beyond. Somewhere in the distance, a single night-bird called, its voice carrying over the plain. The lion did not stir. The moment for action had come, and the man knew the next move had to be made before the darkness brought others to where he lay. Daniel and Joseph moved toward the vehicle with a steady, deliberate pace, their steps measured so the sound would not carry in sharp bursts across the camp. The lion lay where he had fallen, his head resting against the earth, eyes half closed in the dim firelight. His sides lifted and fell in shallow rhythm, the breath audible now in the quiet between insect calls. At the back of the truck, Daniel pulled out the stretcher board kept for emergencies, a thick, reinforced panel wide enough to hold the weight of an adult male lion. It had been used before for antelope, even once for a young zebra, but never for something of this size and power. The plan would require not only care, but absolute calm. A single wrong movement could startle the lion into trying to rise, and in his state, that would cause more damage than the wound itself. Together they carried the board toward him, holding it low. Joseph kept his eyes on the lion's face, watching for the slightest flicker of change in his gaze or tension in his muscles. The lion shifted once, his forepaw sliding across the dust, but he did not lift his head. When they reached him, they paused just outside the length of his body, letting their presence settle before taking another step. The air between them felt taut, heavy with the knowledge that this was the only chance to move him before the night deepened and the risks increased. Daniel crouched first, placing one hand against the ground for balance while the other eased the stretcher into position beside the lion's body. The smell of blood was stronger now, mingling with the earthy scent of his mane. Joseph knelt opposite, his movements matching Daniel's pace so there was no sudden change for the lion to react to. His tail twitched once, slow and uneven, before lying still again. That small movement, Daniel knew, meant he was aware of them but had chosen not to resist, whether from exhaustion or some measure of tolerance. With slow precision, they angled the board beneath him, working one side under his chest and the other beneath his hips. His weight settled onto it gradually, the solid panel taking the strain. The lion's breathing quickened for a moment, nostrils flaring, then eased back into its shallow rhythm. His eyes opened briefly, catching the firelight in a dull glint before closing again. Lifting together, they rose in unison, their grip steady on the edges of the stretcher. The lion's head rested against the wood, mane spilling to one side, and his limbs hung loosely, no longer carrying his weight. Each step toward the shaded corner of camp was taken with care, the path chosen for the smoothest ground to avoid jolts. Daniel kept his focus forward, knowing the sooner they reached shelter, the sooner the lion could rest without being in the open. They set him down in the narrow space between the supply tent and the outer thorn fence, where the fire's glow barely reached but the scent of humans remained strong enough to deter scavengers. His tail gave one final twitch, the tip curling before going still. The board held him level, his breathing steady if faint, and in the quiet that followed, it was clear the hardest part of the night had just begun. If he were to see morning, every moment from now on would matter. For the first hours after moving him, the lion barely shifted. He lay in the shaded corner of camp, his breathing shallow but steady, eyes half closed as flies circled lazily around his mane. Daniel and Joseph worked quietly, keeping their distance except to place water within easy reach. The basin was refilled often, though at first he drank little, taking only a few slow laps before resting his head again. Through the heat of the day and into the cool of the night, they watched for any sign of change, knowing that in his weakened state, even the smallest movement could signal either recovery or decline. The wound along his flank was cleaned with care, the rangers working only when he was still, their hands steady, their voices low. He did not resist, though his ears twitched at the touch, and his eyes followed their movements until they stepped back. By the second morning, the dust clinging to his coat had begun to thin, where he shifted and rolled slightly to ease his weight. When water was placed near his muzzle, he drank more than before, each swallow stronger, his tongue sweeping the basin's edge with quiet persistence. The meat they offered was soft, cut into strips that required little effort to chew. At first he ate sparingly, but as the hours passed, his appetite returned in slow increments. Each feeding was met with a little more focus in his gaze. Daniel noted how his breathing, once shallow and uneven, now came deeper, his chest expanding with more strength. From their position a few paces away, the men kept their observation steady but unobtrusive. This was not a process to rush. Every action was measured against the same truth. If his strength did not return soon, the balance would tip again toward the risks that had nearly ended him. Yet each small improvement built on the last. By late afternoon, his eyes held a sharper light, the dull glaze of exhaustion replaced by something steadier. His ears began to track the calls of birds beyond the camp, his head turning slightly to follow distant sounds. On the third day, as the sun dropped toward the horizon, the air shifted with the cooler breath of evening. The lion stirred, pushing himself first onto his forelegs, then pausing with his head lowered as though gauging his own balance. His muscles tensed, the wound pulling slightly at the skin along his flank, but he did not falter. With a slow, deliberate effort, he brought his hind legs beneath him and rose to stand. This time there was no sway in his stance, no quick adjustment to keep from falling. He stood level, head lifted, his breath deep and even. The wind moved through the thorn fence, carrying the faint scent of the plains beyond. He looked toward it for a long moment, the fading light brushing against the curve of his mane, before settling back into stillness, strong enough now to choose when to move again. The evening light stretched long across the camp, turning the dust a muted gold and casting the thorn fence in thin, sharp shadows. The air had cooled enough for the scent of the plains to drift in, dry grass, faint earth, and the distant trace of other animals moving somewhere beyond sight. The lion stood near the edge of the cleared ground, his body held steady, his breathing deep and unhurried. The wound along his flank had begun to close, the raw edges darkened and drawn together, though the scar would remain. Daniel and Joseph stood a few paces back, saying nothing, their presence quiet and watchful. For hours they had let him decide the pace, knowing the moment for departure would be his alone to choose. He shifted his weight, testing the ground beneath his paws, then stepped forward until the first blades of grass brushed against his legs. His movements were unhurried but certain, the muscles in his shoulders working in smooth rhythm now, his tail lifting slightly with each stride. The air carried no urgency, only the steady pull of the land that waited beyond. The grass ahead swayed in the light breeze, bending and straightening as if opening a path for him. He paused just before crossing fully into its cover, lifting his head toward the horizon where the sun balanced low, a deep orange sinking into the rim of the plains. For a long moment, he turned his head back toward the camp. His eyes moved over the figures standing still in the glow, their shapes quiet against the backdrop of fading light. There was no sound but the low hum of insects and the soft shift of grass. Then, without a sound, he faced forward again and stepped into the taller cover. His back was straight, his stride even, and the outline of his mane swayed gently with each movement until the grass swallowed it from view. Within seconds, he was gone, the space he had occupied blending back into the rhythm of the plain as if it had never been interrupted. The grass closed behind him, the breeze smoothing the last trace of his passage. In the stillness that followed, the only movement left was the slow drift of shadows stretching across the camp and the fading warmth of the sun against the earth.